Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm excited to be talking to Johnny Berchtold all about Murdaugh death in the family. And in starting off, I wanted to talk about the incredible amount of research and resources you were given by the show's creators when you first jumped into this. I've heard it's like a 400-page document of absolutely everything from family photos to information. But
Right.
I specifically heard you say that one of the things that was really helpful within that was looking at childhood pictures and kind of really understanding the environment of the family that Paul grew up in. And I just wanted to ask a little bit more about how that started to formulate a lot of the idea of who he was for you to play him.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, what a gift, right? Like never are you given 400, I think it was like 450 pages. And I mean, I went through everything, right? But I think, as a actor, when you jump into a character, you try to like fill in the blanks with, okay, how do we get to this point? What was their childhood like? And that was given to me, right? Like I had these photographs from, hunting trips and family vacations, things that like I didn't experience in my childhood, or I had a different experience with, vacations or, family barbecues. But it just really filled in that type of that upbringing, especially like in a, privileged family or environment like Paul was raised. And so, yeah, it was just like incredible to look through and sort of get a idea of what those years were like and how we got to that point. I was just like the most incredible gift of all
Yeah.
time. Research team did an amazing job.
Yeah. Because part of what we see in the ecosystem of this family specifically is problems are made to disappear and go away, which ultimately for Paul meant there weren't always the consequences that should have existed for certain things. We learned that he had an underage drinking charge that was disappeared and nobody knew about for many years. And it's interesting to look at him and his brother and the way that they kind of exist in that system in different ways and respond to it differently. And so how did you look at the way that Paul kind of has this like rebellion and it's almost like he's testing the limits of it and how far he can push it sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's what I really like about, especially the way that we hone in on that dynamic. It's like two different roads of how someone could be raised in a privileged environment could go. And, you know, you just got to think about the amount of pressure that would come in being in a family like the Murdochs, and how that could manifest. And yeah, the underage drinking is, that comes out of, the lack of consequence. It's absolutely, I think he's a victim of the way he was raised. And yeah, back to the photo things, like there's photos of him drinking when he was underage. And it's like that was sort of normalized in that environment. And so, especially playing with bouncing ideas off with Will Harrison, who plays Buster, we got to sort of explore that dynamic in the way that we interacted in scenes too, which is why I love, there's a moment later on in the series where they can finally connect for the first time, um, because it doesn't have to be one way or the other. And I think with these brothers, you sort of start to see a breaking of a cycle, and a cycle that's existed for generations in a family like the Murdochs, which was like really interesting to explore because it's like, you just look at the way these kids were raised, and yeah, you go one way or the other. You lean into it or you try to break it. And I think both of those boys were trying to do something like that.
And you brought up that point of he was a victim of the system he was raised in, but one of the things that the show really tries to do with him is explore the complexities and the fact that there are always multiple truths. Nobody is singularly the worst thing they ever did or singularly the best thing they ever did. And I imagine that that was something that you thought about very specifically going into every scene on a show like this of how do we humanize it but not excuse it. And so what was a lot of that internal dialogue like for you to
Yeah.
constantly have to think of?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's no excuse for the horrible things that happened in this story, right? Like that's something that I wanted to make sure we kept intact. And I think a big thing with the way that we told the story was just sort of try to understand how we got from point A to point B. And so, I've been saying Paul is like the example of not only two things can be true at once, but like a million things can be true at once. And he did things that are completely inexcusable. And caused real actual harm and consequence. And then at the same time, he was a victim himself. And so for me, it was just important to bridge that gap. You have a kid who is a product of the way he was raised,
Yeah.
which led to a life being taken. And we find him at like a really interesting time post that experience where he's like trying to figure out what to do now. How do I go forward? Well, okay, I've been taught to sort of run away or bury these problems with these coping mechanisms that I've been taught or that have been allowed. Maybe that's not working. And so what was really interesting for us to explore is like, what were those moments like when he was by himself? Like we show it in the show, but something that was so interesting to me was the fact that he kept the obituaries in his car, in his truck with him. And that's something that was proven. And you got to say, well, okay, well, there's people over here saying that he never felt any remorse, but what does this tell me? And so it really was about just trying to like do justice to all angles and consider all possibilities. And I think that's, humanity, right? Like we're never one thing. Um, so I just wanted to make sure that I was coloring all sides for Paul.
And in playing him, because there is video footage to be able to kind of like really look at the detailing of, his mannerisms, how he spoke, how he moved.
Yeah.
I've heard you mention that one of the things that you started to kind of see were, certain ticks and thinking about
Mhm.
the not just the manifestation of like how do I physically play that, but psychologically, where does this stem from? What causes this to exist in the way that the body is kind of physically responding to something inside. And so I wanted to ask about, what you kind of found in that journey of discovery for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, well, something that's so interesting. I was familiar with the case beforehand. I had watched, docuseries and sort of went down a rabbit hole. But I remember they talked about this thing he would do with his fingers when he was, you know, drinking, and it was this like sort of tick. And I remember being so struck by that because I also, I'm someone who has tic disorder, and I also have that tick just in my everyday life with my fingers, and I have done the work to try to figure out where that comes from. And so I really connected with that aspect. And so what was a great challenge for me was to figure out where his come from. And all of that kind of stuff stems from maybe anxiety or like a insecurity or like a need for something. And playing a character that's inspired by a real person that's been documented, there is so much documentation of the way he walked and talked and carried himself, is a gift. But you don't want to just like do an impression and be like, okay, well, he walks like this, so I'm going to walk like this. Like I was really interested in, well, why does he walk like that? Why does he walk with his shoulders raised? Like why is he barreling towards everything that he walks towards? Or why does this alter ego when he drinks come out? And that was really interesting for me to try and figure out where that stems from. um it's just, yeah, it's wild. The human mind is so interesting because it just manifests in so many ways.
Yeah. Someone should study it.
Yeah, someone should study that.
I mean, with the inebriation as well, there's so many scenes in this series and in each of the episodes where we see drinking as a way to try to escape himself.
Mm,
There's a different version of what that means and looks like when he's out on the boat than there is after that incident when he's,
right.
in the bar with the Australians drinking and,
Hmm.
kind of trying to escape in a different way. And so, how would you look at scenes like that and the idea of playing the inebriation of this character, but the fact that it's always kind of stemming to a very different place each time?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think he was so young, especially when the boat crash happened. And I think at that point in time, at least in our version of the story, he is like really honing in on that party animal. Like this is like for me, I remember that time, and it's like, oh well, I just want to be included. I want to be liked. I want to be with my peers. I want to like hang out with my friends. And look, I've got all of these resources. You come hang out with me. And so, I think that's just like the Murdaughs. They really love to host too. least in our story. And so I think that's where it comes from. And then after that, it really is that escapism sort of thing, or this worked before, so it should work again. It's almost like that, here, have a drink, don't think about your feelings. Especially, in the Bahamas episode when he's on a family vacation, they're like, yeah, this is how we get through this. But it's not working this time, and it's like manifesting in a really destructive way. Um, it's just, alcohol and young people just don't mix very well, I think, obviously. Um, and so for him, the reasoning behind it all changes throughout the story too, until it just doesn't work anymore. And I think that was so beautiful in the writing, because substance abuse too is like a really important storyline for me. Um, and I've seen the effects of what it can do. And so I really wanted to protect that and make it realistic and not play some sort of, stereotyped version of alcohol abuse.
Yeah, and there's that aspect in the scene that you were mentioning in the Bahamas where he goes out drinking with the strangers, and it's just, constantly the more I drink, the more I can try to forget. But you see it never works. Like he's still reeling in that place to the point where he ends up asking them to punch him and ends up spitting in one of their faces to make them do it. And
Yeah.
it's just that essence of a desperation to feel something, anything
Feel
that can
something. Oh, right.
fit.
I think that's what he's constantly chasing too. Is just I need to feel something other than the environment that I'm in, right? Like I don't know what to do with these feelings. Um, but I need to do something, right? And that's such like a scary place to be, I think. It can be such like an unknowing void to be in when you have so much going on in your head and you don't know what to do with it. And I think that's how you get the story of Paul.
Yeah, and there's also a lot in his story of he's a son who wants his dad to love him and constantly feels disparaged, put down, rejected, pushed away in different ways. And sometimes it's just a little dig. Sometimes it's not being included in something that his brother's being included, and sometimes it gets physical
1,000%.
as well. How did that kind of really play into so much of what you uncovered about him?
Yeah, well, I mean that's what it is, right? It's like not some big thing that happens. It's over time. It's like it's a, you know, this story goes back generations. It's a cycle. And you can't deny, at least, in our version, like that Alex sort of went through the same thing with his dad and then the same exact thing with his, so it's just, and that's what I love about the whole Buster and Paul dynamic is that, like, well, one is leaning into it. The one figured out how to play the game. And so to be in those scenes too, especially those family scenes where, Alec is, praising Buster, and I'm sort of there as Paul, just taking it in, and well, he's not saying those things to me. And that was so great about working with Jason too and Patricia, is that, like, when it would be on, say, my coverage, and we're doing a scene when Buster has accomplished something and they're praising him, Jason would throw something, uh like a dig towards me that's not in the script, to really make me feel small in that moment. It was so genius. I was like, that is something that you don't get from every actor, where they're like giving you 200% of the things that you need to really feel. It's like in the writing, there's the subtext, but he would give you just the highest, baseline of, like, what does this mean? What does this mean for this character in this moment? And he would just give those things to you, and Patricia too. And it was so incredible to witness, and then be on the other side of that and just sort of feel like, wait, no, I hold on, I am really feeling like I am underappreciated in this family here. um which is just great. But yeah, it just helped solidify those dynamics, I think.
Because it also feeds in a lot to his relationship with his brother. If you're
Oh yeah.
made to always kind of compete for that place and feeling like, well, I'm always rejected and he's always accepted, that just kind of increases the space between them. And so, when you have a moment like when they get into a physical altercation with each other of frustration, how would that off, even if it's physical, how would it always be something that just felt so emotional to go into?
Yeah, I mean, well, I love that scene in the first episode when they get in a fight, and it's sort of like, in front of the entire party, and the parents are sort of like, okay, break it up. But it's like, oh, this has been happening. Like this is it isn't just like it all led to this moment. It's like this is the dynamic.
Yeah.
They can like hang out buddy buddy and then, next thing you know, they're like scrapping on the ground. Which I thought was so interesting. I think we get every single iteration of that brotherly dynamic with them, and how the pressure from their parents manifests with each other and sort of turn them against each other, or you know finally connect them in ways when they start to realize, oh, we've been sort of raised to be conditioned to feel this way, maybe. um but yeah, I loved scrapping with Will. That was one of our chemistry reads too, by the way, which was like insane because suddenly we're like in the room, we're like, all right, you good? Like, nice to meet you. I promise, like, I won't hurt you. And then, you're in it and it's like
Yeah.
amazing.
Nice to meet you. Let's fight.
Nice to meet you. That's typically, that's acting. Nice to meet you. Let's kiss. Let's fight.
Yeah.
Um,
It's also so fun to watch that scene because neither of them are good fighters either.
oh my God. No, it's like, yeah, it's just like, let's scrap and throw hands in the dirt. And it's just messy. It's messy.
Yeah.
They're, Southern boys, they're country boys, at the end of the day.
And in talking about the entire sequence of scenes that you have around the boat incident, there's a lot of different levels and layers that go into playing each of those moments. And, I wanted to kind of start by asking specifically about filming the scenes beforehand, before they're on the boat and they're kind of sitting there with all of his friends. And, he's kind of in a very different headspace to all of them. And
Yeah.
like, feeling very separated to the point where you're then sitting in front of the campfire singing along to that country song, but he's not singing it to or for anyone else and no one else is joining in. It's just that's how out of his head he is at that point. And so what were some of the facets that went into that?
It's so interesting. We filmed the boat sequence and the beach party sequences on the same night, but we filmed the boat sequence first. So I started the night in a pretty heightened place. And it was really, I mean, genuinely, it was so heavy. There was such an immense amount of care that went into it. And, I gotten really close to all of those actors, and, we've been hanging out and sort of prepping ourselves for shooting that sequence. And, we had such a wonderful conversation beforehand where I sort of was like, I apologize in advance. Cause it's not, acting is acting, but it's still not fun to do something like that. And because everyone brought their A game, and it was in a controlled environment, they put the boat in like a blackout tent and put it on this rig. And so the camera could get really close and personal. It was just like this immense burst of adrenaline that, like, after the first take, I burst into tears because it was just so, it just hits you all at once. Like, there was an immense amount of respect that went into shooting that sequence. And I also drank like a lot of energy drinks, so I was like already, feeling pretty hopped up. And um everyone was so careful and respectful in shooting that sequence. And I remember leaving that tent and all of us looking at each other and just being like, just sort of like hugging each other and like thank you for that. Like, hopefully we got something that is, uh right within the story. And then we went into the bonfire sequence. So I sort of knew where it was headed. I knew where where we all were emotionally headed, which really helped. And before every take on that uh, beach party scene, I would like run laps on the beach so I could just be like constantly out of breath and sort of just drained emotionally, and but also heightened, um just really trying to feel as much as I could, so that way your body is feeling it too. It's a really weird thing, like your body doesn't know you're acting. And so when you can get yourself into a heightened place, it can be really helpful, to have, your hands shaking, or like, you're just so out of breath. Something that it's hard to replicate if you're just like sitting chilling. I don't know. I just thought it was helpful, but yeah, it was helpful knowing where we were headed within the story by shooting those sequences um, backwards. And also, I was really happy that we got that out of the way early on because I was really nervous about shooting that that stuff. it's just heavy. It's just really, really heavy stuff. And you just want to make sure you do it right.
Because also with the boat sequence and those scenes, there's no clear footage from that night of what happened. And it's, hazy pieces kind of coming together, and the way that it's directed, like you were mentioning how close the camera was to all of you.
Yeah.
And it's kind of edited in these flickers with very little light. And I was curious about the conversations of everybody figuring out what is it that we want to depict? How do we want to depict it, given that we're piecing it together as best we can from the details that are available?
Yeah, I mean, I just love the way that they were able to construct that sequence. It's just pure chaos. It's underage chaos. It's out of control, and it's really scary. It's the last moments of someone's life that we were showing, and we really just want to try to understand what those moments were like in a truthful way. And there is footage of that night, um not on the boat, but there is footage of like events that led up to that moment. Um and I think getting close with the camera, getting personal like that, really just sort of shows just the turmoil across the board. But there was, again, there was so much care put into it, and I think that was like one of those things where, like, okay, we're not going to show too much. We're not going to be egregious with it. We're going to show just enough to sort of understand, oh, that there was like so much going on underneath the surface that manifested on the water that night, which I thought was just incredibly crafted. That whole sequence still gives me a pit in my stomach. It's so awful.
Yeah. And then immediately after that, we then cut to seeing you in the hospital. And that's such an interesting thing to figure out how to play, because everything that's happened that night, he doesn't know where Mallory is. He's probably got concussion. He's also been drinking all night. He
Yeah.
hasn't slept. And by the time you add all of those components together, that's kind of a lot of things to look at manifesting into that scene. And so, how did you set about approaching it?
Yeah, well, something that's really interesting is there is footage of Paul that night in the hospital. So again, I had that to go off of, and a lot of reporting and research went into what it was like in the hospital that night. Um, and again, acting inebriated it's always a challenge. But you have to ask, not only what is it like to act inebriated, but what is this person like when they're drunk? And then you add all of these insane things that happened that led up to that moment. And with the footage, it was just about, like, not getting too much in my head and just holding on to what I learned about that night, and just sort of like letting it fly. There was a lot of improv that night. But yeah, shooting that entire hospital sequence was really, really intense. And the way that Steven directed it, it was sort of like this like ongoing live wire thing, because so much is happening, and you have Alec trying to piece it all together, and Paul is being loud, and he's throwing a fit, and he's really, really drunk, and they're trying to get information from him. um it was just about like honing in on that chaos, right? And just so I don't know how much you can really prepare for that, but I think across the board with this entire project, it was just about like learning as much as I could, and then just sort of letting it fly and hoping that it was in the ballpark. Yeah.
And there's almost kind of two different versions of and kind of ways of playing him, because there's the way that you play him before and leading up to that night, and then there's the way that you play him after all of that. And even just some of the physical changes and body language, and kind of feeling more shut off and closed off from everything and everyone around him. And what were some of those changes and kind of manifestations that you started to kind of feel the difference of very quickly?
Yeah, I mean, he became sort of like, ostracized by his community, of course. And so I think before the boat crash, you have someone who really took pride in being that guy for his friends, like, let's party, let's hang. And he completely loses that afterwards. And so I just think you have this guy who doesn't know what to do with finally seeing consequence for the first time, really. And so yeah, physicality is always really important to me in a character. I think that's one of the more interesting things that I love to dive into when I get into a character. But I just through it all wanted to make sure that it was consistent with him, but show a change and a growth, either inwards or outwards. And yeah, that manifests in so many different ways. I really love how they have him sort of working on that field and trying to do something physical, something hands-on to try and build growth. But he's sort of become this outcast, and so he's sort of retreating inwards, which is an interesting thing to play for a character like Paul, who is so outward, you know? Um, so I really just, yeah, try to hone in on that idea.
Yeah. And I'm going to flag spoilers just in case anybody doesn't know the kind of outcome of what happened to him later on. But, at the end of episode 6, we see the shooting play out and we see that moment. But at that point, the camera doesn't show us who's on the other side of it. We now know it's his father who is the killer. And there's something kind of like heartbreaking about watching him have this like tender connected moment with his mom and the conversation the two of them have, and you kind of feel like they're both finding their own ways to move forward finally.
Yeah.
And then for that to happen, and I know that you and kind of Patricia both wanted to just play the whole scene and that whole sequence of events, really going, they didn't know what was about to happen. They didn't know that he was going to come for them. But you see that flicker that you have in your eyes of recognition.
Mm.
And so I wanted to ask about, just kind of like building up that whole sequence of events leading into that final moment and then just building that flicker of recognition when he kind of realizes what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think, God, it's such a dark place to put your headspace at. I think anyone who thinks about the story. And I really do love that build up with Maggie and Paul and how they're talking, and it's like talking about their future. It's sort of something that they were never granted. Um, and yeah, something that was so surprising to me was how comfortable I felt shooting that sequence that night. And I like didn't understand why, because I mean, I had a pit in my stomach for a week leading up to that sequence. And then I got on set, and having, worked so closely with Patricia and having gotten to know her, and, having these wonderful conversations together, there was such an ease and a comfort. And I was like, why? Well, look at what we're doing right now. I was so confused as to why. And then it hit me. Well, yeah, Paul and Maggie didn't know what was coming. And so, as an actor, you try to put yourself in the headspace of the character at that point in time. And I think with Patricia and I, we just sort of felt that, we were like, just like a mother and son out at the kennels, like they've been a million times. And then it was in those moments where we see the shot go off, or, she hears it or whatever, that it really hits you how unfair the entire thing was. Um, I mean, obviously, but it's like that last moment of, oh, this is what he saw. And everyone came together in such a way that was, I mean, honestly, pretty upsetting. They recreated something so well. Everyone brought their A game with the costumes and the set, the production design, the way that Kat uh, beautifully directed it in a way that really made it impactful. I think when you watch it, you sort of lose your breath because you're like, oh my God, this is the reality of what happened. Um, it was scary, right? Like in my head, I'm like, this is the closest thing to what Paul saw, the last moment. And so the scenes leading up to it, I really wanted to honor that future that was taken from him and from Maggie. But yeah, man, shooting that sequence, we did it over 2 nights, and there was just an immense amount of respect across the board. You have a crew of 300 people, and everyone was completely silent. There was like a massive conversation that happened before we started shooting, where it was like, let's not forget what we're doing here. Um, and yeah, I think it was beautifully directed and constructed, and I'm so grateful that it was Patricia and Jason in that scene with me because, they just made it uh, as comfortable as can be.
Yeah, I appreciate kind of the level of consideration that you've taken with every single choice in telling this whole story, and
You
you know
have
the help that
to,
the whole
right?
team has. Yeah,
You have to. I can't sit here and be like, oh yeah, it was like, of course we had levity. You have to have levity in filming a story like this, but like you look at what we are doing here. There's an important story to tell, and we have to honor that, right? So I don't know.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking all about it. Really, really appreciate all of your wonderful insights that you shared.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.